Hello and welcome to the Lighthouse webinar about the drug trial with arbaclofen, the clinical drug trial or study that we are planning and getting underway for individuals with the 16p11.2 deletion. I'm Dr. Paul Wang. I'm trained as a developmental behavioral pediatrician, and I've been working at the Simons Foundation for 5 years now under the direction of Dr. Wendy Chung. I think that many, if not all of you, know Dr. Chung's name, and I'm very happy to have her here with me today as co-host for this webinar. I hope that you can all see and hear me okay on your screen. Before I turn it over briefly to Dr. Chung for some introductions, I want to let you know that we won't be able to see or hear you today, but we want to make this session interactive by welcoming your questions in the chat on Facebook or in the Q&A box if you're using the Zoom link. Please remember, questions asked on Facebook are public, meaning other people can see them, and we encourage everyone to avoid including any personal health information and confidential information for your own privacy. So in terms of today's goals, we'll be sharing information about the Lighthouse study, including the study's goals, who is eligible, travel requirements, other demands and burdens on the families who participate, and we'll also be providing background on the drug arbaclofen that is being studied here. There will be plenty of time after we run through our slides to answer questions that you submit through Facebook or through Zoom. And we'll be answering a combination of the questions that have already been submitted ahead of time and questions that are asked live today. Let me turn it over to Dr. Chung.
Thanks for the introduction, Paul. I'm thrilled to be able to have so many of you out there today. It's been a long time. As some of you know, I'm the Director of Clinical Research at the Simons Foundation and have been working with Dr. Wang for the last 5 years. He is a really great guy, and I'm very glad that he's going to be the one leading the arbaclofen clinical trial. Many of you also know that I also have another hat that I wear, which is to be Principal Investigator for Simons Searchlight. I know that not everyone out there is aware of the details of what Simons Searchlight is, but it's a very large program that I've had the pleasure of leading for the last 10 years. It's an an audacious research program that's international, and we have over 4,000 families around the world who are all gathered together, working together, to be able to advance understanding, better supports, and ultimately better treatments for the neurogenetic conditions that we study. I think this community knows that 16p11.2 is near and dear to my heart, especially because we started the journey with you guys almost a decade ago in terms of understanding the condition. I still remember our first meeting back at Gatlinburg and being able to continue with in-person understandings or in-person evaluations, going to online, and now what I'm pleased is the next phase of this, really thinking about clinical trials. So with this, I hope those of you who haven't been part of the studies have a sense of how dedicated we are to the community, to 16p. In particular, this Lighthouse clinical trial is a separate study from Simons Searchlight, so you don't have to be part of Simons Searchlight to engage in the clinical trial. And reciprocally, if you're part of Simons Searchlight, you don't have to be part of the clinical trial to remain as part of Simons Searchlight. So these are two distinct and separate groups, but we do hope that it's available, or we want to make sure that everyone in the community knows that it's available to everyone with 16p. With this, we do hope that some of you that hear about this, if you decide not to be part of specifically the Lighthouse trial, that you will consider joining Simons Searchlight, because through that, it's a great way to get to know you better and to disseminate information to you about the condition and how to improve the lives of those in your family. So I'll turn it back over to Dr. Wang.
Thank you, Dr. Chung. Let me share my screen and we will get started with the slides. And just so you know, there's a total of about just 20 slides, but we'll take our time going through it. And then, as we mentioned before, there will be plenty of time for handling or for trying to answer the questions that you send in after that. So the study, once again, we're calling the Lighthouse study. It's a clinical trial of an experimental medication called arbaclofen for the 16p11.2 deletion. What I'll be going through in the slides today is first a little bit of background on Safari's mission. You've really already heard about that essentially from Dr. Chung. I want to tell you a little bit about a subsidiary of Safari, which is called Clinical Research Associates, or CRA, which is officially sponsoring the study. It'll tell you about some of the past research that a lot of you have already participated in regarding the 16p deletion, and also research on mouse models of this 16p deletion, really just to try to tell you how we got to the point that we're having this webinar today to tell you about the study that is being planned. Then we'll talk a little bit about the drug, arbaclofen, talk about what the study will be like for participants, and also address how COVID-19 has affected the plans and the design for the study. So Safari's mission, and Searchlight, of course, is a big, very important and prominent project or program within Safari. The mission is to improve the diagnosis, understanding, and treatment of autism spectrum disorders by funding innovative research of the highest quality and relevance. A subsidiary of Safari is called Clinical Research Associates, an affiliate or subsidiary, and the goals of CRA are to better understand the causes of autism, to accelerate translational and clinical research, and improve the lives of individuals with ASD and related conditions as well. And what that has boiled down to for over the last 5 years or so for CRA is to sponsor research in both mouse models of the 16p deletion and some research as well in people who have autism and or have the 16p deletion, whether or not they have diagnoses of autism. And I'm just going to run through a little bit of that research now. So on the Safari side and Searchlight side, of course, the Simon Simplex collection and Spark, we have learned that the 16p11.2 deletion, as well as a lot of other genetic conditions, which are listed on the right-hand side of this slide, can increase the risk for autism and other developmental challenges. 16p11.2 deletion is one of the conditions that we've really studied the most, both in projects sponsored by Simons and Searchlight, and in other research that has been sponsored by other agencies that we've tried to support in many instances. As far as 16p specifically, the participation of many of you in what was originally called Simon's VIP, and of course is now Simon's Searchlight, has helped us to understand that first, speech and language impairments are very, very common. So we came at this originally with the autism angle, but we've learned now that there are many people with the 16p deletion who don't have diagnosis of autism. But even in those who don't, the speech and language impairments are exceptionally common. That's something that can be seen not only working with the child in school, parents can see it, speech therapists, of course, and teachers, they can see it. And what they see on the bottom left of this slide is that there's only about 11%, hopefully you can see me moving the cursor around here, there are only about 11% of people with the 16p11.2 deletion who seem to have typical speech development. And all of the rest have some kind of speech and language challenges, whether it's just articulation or a more severe and more pervasive condition called CAS, childhood apraxia of speech, really difficulty with the coordination of everything that you need to do to speak, your lips, your tongue, your palate, the breathing that gets coordinated with it, all the muscles in the back of your throat, the pharynx and larynx, severe difficulties in some cases coordinating all of those muscles and the breathing, as we mentioned before, to produce what is typical sounding speech. Experimenters who look more deeply at the brain also see differences in some of the brainwave tracings. Again, some of you have participated in this research. They put electrodes on the scalp of the head to try to record the electrical activity of the brain. In this first panel, on sort of the right middle, you see just a typical tracing, and there's this one particular wave that happens about 100 milliseconds after a sound is heard. In people with the 16p11.2 deletion, that wave is delayed about 50%. So it seems that there's something about the hearing as well as the motor articulation that can be challenged in 16p11.2. To try to understand this better, Simon's Foundation and CRA as well have sponsored some research in animal models of the 16p deletion. So these, of course, these are not people, but these are mice who have deletions in their chromosomes that are very, very similar to what's happening for people with the 16p deletion. And one of the things they found is that a particular receptor in nerves called the mGluR5 receptor, they felt seemed to be important in the differences in the brain function that are seen in 16p. And so these researchers thought about it and they said, maybe a treatment that targets mGluR5 could make a difference. And one of the things that targets mGluR5 in a slightly indirect way is a drug called arbaclofen. It doesn't latch on right to the mGluR5 receptor, but it actually decreases the amount of glutamate, which does naturally latch on and activate the mGluR5. It decreases the glutamate, and they figured that might be helpful. So they went on to test that in the mouse models. So this was research on treatment that has been sponsored through Simon's and Searchlight and CRA. They used these mice who had a deletion in 16p that's similar to the human deletion. And what they found is that memory was improved when the mice were treated with this drug arbaclofen. And what was really made a lot of people excited about this is that it wasn't just one lab that found this effect, but it was 3 different labs that all found this effect. And that's really important. When different research labs can replicate each other and show that, oh, it wasn't just something funny in the first lab, but 3 labs actually all found this effect, that makes us think that maybe there's something real here. And we just have a little diagram here at the bottom left of what the experiment was like with the mice. So first, on day 1, the mice are put into this little chamber with 2 objects that are the same. And mouse finds that kind of interesting and it explores them. They're given 10 minutes twice during that day to explore, and they figure out, oh, those things are pretty much the same. And then on the second day, one of the objects is switched out. And what happens is that a mouse without the 16p deletion finds that new object more interesting because it's never seen that. So it ends up spending more time exploring that new object to figure out what it's all about. And the graph on the right just shows you what's happening. In the typical mouse, what they call the wild type no deletion, it preferentially explores that new object. Whereas for the mouse with the 16p deletion, it's 50-50. They're looking at both of them like both of them are kind of new. But then when you treat them with arbaclofen, then that mouse also spends more time exploring the new object. So it seems like it has a better memory that, oh yeah, it already saw one of them before. So it doesn't need to spend as much time exploring it. So that is one of the experiments in mice that provides the basis for thinking about studies in people with this same drug. So the next step is what would be called translational research, translating the finding in mice to people. But of course, that's very challenging because people just aren't mice. There have been many medications that have been found to work wonderfully in mice, but may or may not have an effect in people. And that's going across a lot of conditions. One researcher who I've heard before speaking, and a researcher from the drug industry said, boy, we can cure cancer really easily in mice. But unfortunately, not all of those treatments translate over to safe and effective treatments for people. So the effects of arbaclofen on memory in mice are encouraging. And in fact, there's other research that showed it helps motor function in mice. And that makes us think that maybe it can also help motor function in people with the 16p deletion, including maybe speech motor, oral motor, all of that articulation, phonologic issues, childhood apraxia of speech. We're encouraged that that's a possibility, but there's no guarantee that the mouse effects will translate into benefits for people with the 16p11.2 deletion. Let me tell you a bit about the drug arbaclofen before going on to tell you about exactly what this particular study is going to be like. So the drug is called arbaclofen, and the chemists have other names for it. If you search the medical literature, the medical journals, you'll see sometimes it's referred to as capital R dash baclofen as opposed to ARBACLOFEN. In the older journals, it's sometimes called L-baclofen just because they use a different naming system. Now it's R, it was L. And then there was another company that did some studies with it, and they called it STX-209 after Seaside Therapeutics was the company, and it was their drug number 209. The encouraging thing, or the thing that makes us feel better about the safety of arbaclofen is that it's really closely related to racemic baclofen. Racemic baclofen is actually an FDA-approved medication that has been used in tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of pediatric and adult patients already. So it's very widely used to treat people with cerebral palsy who have spasticity, stiffness in their muscles. As I mentioned, even today, still, it's being widely used, and probably definitely over 10,000 pediatric patients a year are treated with racemic baclofen. And racemic baclofen is actually a 50-50 mixture of arbaclofen and S-baclofen. So in other words, all of these 10,000 patients are already getting arbaclofen, but it's always mixed together 50-50 with S-baclofen. Arbaclofen and S-baclofen look like this. They really have the same chemical formula. It's just that one is a mirror image of the other, just like your hands are mirror images of each other, or your shoes are mirror images of each other. So again, they have the same chemical formula, exactly the same number of oxygen and hydrogen and chloride and carbon atoms in them. They're just put together as mirror images. In this study, we'll be using only arbaclofen. Why is that? Well, arbaclofen and S-baclofen, as we said, are mirror images, but arbaclofen is actually 10 to 100 times more active than S-baclofen in the nerve cells. And what it does is that it stimulates a particular receptor called the GABA B receptor, which is found in nerve cells. So S-baclofen is not being used because it's basically dead weight. And it's actually possible, it's not proven, that some of the side effects, maybe a lot of the side effects, are related to S-baclofen instead of arbaclofen. Now, arbaclofen has been tested already in people, specifically in children with autism and also in children with a different genetic syndrome called Fragile X syndrome. And it was tested by the company I mentioned called Seaside Therapeutics. I'm just going to highlight here some of the results from the study that was run in children with autism, 150 participants, and their ages range from 6 to 21. And the main assessment in that study was a questionnaire called the Aberrant Behavior Checklist. And a high score shows higher symptoms in this. So if your score goes down, that's good. And what happened in that study is that people who got arbaclofen did have the score go down, so that's good. But people who were on placebo, meaning they're just getting a sugar pill essentially, their score also went down, also improved. And there's really no difference between the subjects who got arbaclofen and the subjects who got placebo. But there were actually a number of other measures where the people who received arbaclofen did better than the people who received placebo. So this is a scale called the CGI. This is a score, if you will, that's given by the doctor who's conducting the study with each subject. And there you can see the dark line, the people with arbaclofen, their symptoms decreased more than the people who got placebo. The study with this primary assessment showing no difference is officially negative. FDA regards it as negative. But a lot of researchers and a lot of families really thought that their children were doing better on arbaclofen. So other people have picked up that ball. And there are now 2 new studies which are underway in autism. Neither of them are in the United States. One's in Canada and one's in Europe, we are actually providing them with the drug for those studies, but they are very hopeful, although we don't know what the results of those studies are yet, and we won't know probably for another year or so. They're very hopeful that they will be able to show that arbaclofen helps kids with autism. I want to tell you about some of the common side effects with arbaclofen. So this table is from that study that I was just telling you about, 150 kids and adolescents and young adults, age ranging from 6 to 21 years. The most common side effect on arbaclofen, this is in the autism study, was nausea and vomiting. 16% of the subjects who got arbaclofen had some nausea and vomiting. 10% of the people who got placebo also had some nausea and vomiting. Of course, that's a pretty common thing in children. Children once in a while do, unfortunately, have stomach upset, and they'll even throw up with it. And maybe even if you just get a sugar pill, you might think like, oh, maybe this isn't going to make me feel good. And so you'll say, or you'll actually feel that you're a little bit nauseous. And that's why you do get some people on placebo having all of these various side effects. But it did look like it was more on arbaclofen. Some people got headaches also. That was more than on placebo. Some people were a little bit, it was described as the emotionality. Their mood was just a little more up and down while they were on drug. What's important to note about all of these side effects is in the vast majority of cases, they were brief. They were only when starting the drug or bumping up to a higher dose. And in every case, after the person came off of the drug, either when the study ended or maybe it just resolved before the study ended, the side effects went away. So none of these side effects were permanent. There was also drowsiness, clearly more on drug than on placebo. Some of the subjects showed some irritability. Remember, these are kids with autism. 9% on drug, but in this case, there were actually just as many, if not actually more, on placebo who showed irritability. Same thing with insomnia. There were, looks like, more on placebo on the sugar pill who had insomnia. So that's just by chance, and it looks like the drug is not really causing a problem there. Same with aggression, pretty much the same in the two groups. Diarrhea, hyperactivity, anxiety, all pretty much equal in the two groups, and in some cases, maybe even looking a little bit higher on placebo. The one thing I want to point out is here the drowsiness. It definitely was more on arbaclofen than on placebo. But on the other hand, racemic baclofen, remember that's the drug that is already being used in kids with cerebral palsy. It's also used in adults with multiple sclerosis. Drowsiness is probably a lot higher with that available racemic baclofen than it is with arbaclofen. And that's one of the reasons that we think it's worth it to test arbaclofen rather than the mixture of RNS, which is what racemic baclofen is. So on to the study. As we were planning this clinical trial, we surveyed you. We surveyed the 16p11.2 deletion community. This was back in the spring and summer of 2019. So I want to thank all of you who are online today who participated in this survey. And hopefully there are also new people online today who are new to the community who maybe didn't even hear about the survey back then. We sent it out to everybody in the community and got 207 respondents, which is great. 90% of those people who responded were from the USA. So we also got some people who are from other parts of the world. We asked them, would you be willing to think about participating in a clinical trial? And 114 said yes, with 90% of them in the child to adolescent age. And that's part of the reason that we're really focusing on the child to adolescent age range in this study. We asked folks, what about travel? Would you be willing to travel somewhere in the United States to participate? And people said, yes, we could take 2-day trips, 3-day trips, but no, if the study required us to take like a 2-week trip, that's really not realistic. So better than the 2-week trip are multiple shorter trips. And so we really took that into account as we thought about how to design the study. We also asked families, what are the top concerns you have for your kids? And the top two answers were, first of all, speech language. So that's really not surprising. Obviously, that goes along with the research that we talked about a few slides ago, that the speech language challenges are a big issue for so many families. And just as many families said, learning, memory, cognition, those are big issues for us as well. And then sort of number three on the list was the motor problems. Coordination, motor function was something that 30% of the families indicated were a significant concern for them as well. So we took all of that into account as we were planning the study. Here's an overview of the study. First of all, I just have up a picture of what the study drug will look like. It'll come in a blister pack, and probably you have bought drugs at the local drugstore that are packaged like this. They're in a plastic blister. There's foil on the back end, so you can like poke the tablet through on the back end. The study will be open to both boys and girls from age 5 through age 17. It'll be run at 3 sites in the USA, at Boston, in Houston, and in Seattle. And the reason we chose these sites, and only these sites, is that first of all, we wanted sites that are already experienced with the 16p11.2 population, who have already been working with kids and adolescents who have this genetic diagnosis. And the reason we have only 3 sites is so that we can better coordinate it, so we can really train up all the sites and make sure everybody is doing the study in exactly the same way and really doing it in an excellent way. Whenever you do a study with more sites, it becomes harder to really ensure that the quality of the work that they're doing is equivalent across all the sites. So these are sites that some of you may know already. Some of you may have traveled to these sites already, and we think we are confident that they'll do an excellent job with this study. The study will involve 16 weeks, so about 4 months of treatment, of taking the medication. For the vast majority of kids, that'll be 3 times a day. They'll be taking these tablets. Some of the youngest kids may only take it 2 times a day. That just depends on how well they're tolerating it, whether they have side effects or not. It's a flexible dose study. So that means everybody will go up to the dose that they tolerate. And if they go up to a level where they start getting side effects, then they can back down to a previous level where hopefully they were not having any side effects. And finally, this will be a placebo-controlled study. So some individuals will get essentially the sugar pill instead of getting the active drug. But I'll tell you later how everybody will have a chance to get actual arbaclofen at some point. So in the core study, there will be 4 visits to the site. So the family, if they're not local to Boston, Houston, or Seattle, the families will be asked to travel 4 times to the site where they are doing the study. The first trip will be for what we call screening and day 1. That'll be a 3-day visit. And in the screening, they'll just make sure doing a physical exam and seeing each individual child or adolescent and trying them on the various assessments, just making sure that they really are appropriate. Of course, families will be talking with the sites beforehand, and if there's any reason that they would not be eligible, then they won't have to make the trip. They'll be able to figure that out beforehand, but then they'll also do the hands-on exam at screening just to make sure everybody is appropriate, that it's safe for them to go into the study. So there's a 3-day visit there. And basically what happens then is the family will go home with the medication for about 5 weeks. They'll gradually be going up on the dose. And at day 36, so 5 weeks later, they'll go back to the site for a quick check. And that's again just so that the site doctor can see the child, see the adolescent, do a physical exam, listen to their heart, etc. Really make sure that there's nothing going on that shouldn't be going on, that it's safe for them to continue in this study. So it's a short visit, but it is an important visit. And then again, assuming everything is okay, family goes home again. they'll be home for 11 more weeks, taking medication every day, 3 times a day, probably 2 times a day, maybe for some of the youngest kids, and then come back at the end of treatment, so at the end of the 16 weeks. And here's where there'll be a bunch of assessments done again to see whether the drug has had any effect, any positive or even possibly a negative effect. And that's why that is, again, a slightly longer visit, 2 days at either Boston, Houston, or Seattle. After that, the family goes home and the drug is gradually tapered down. It's not a drug where you go cold turkey and just like stop it all of a sudden. It is a drug where it should be tapered down gradually over approximately 3 weeks. If you're on a lower dose, you'll come off of it more quickly. But then again, at the end of the taper down, the family will be asked to come in one more time. Again, for safety reasons, just make sure everything is going okay. Along the way, there will also be a lot of phone calls while the families are at home just to check on things, make sure things are going okay. After that's all over, after the 16 weeks and the taper down, then all subjects who want to will have an opportunity to enroll, and all subjects who are tolerating the medication well. Of course, if there were side effects, no one's going to force you to do anything. And you can come out of the study at any point if you're uncomfortable, if there are side effects that are not acceptable. But afterwards, kids who have tolerated the medication okay, and families who are still interested will have an opportunity to participate in an open label study. That's what we call a study where everybody gets the active drug, arbaclofen. Everybody knows they're getting it. The doctor knows you're getting it. Nobody's blinded. Nobody's going to be getting a sugar pill. An open label study, all participants get arbaclofen, and that'll be for 4 months. So everybody will have the opportunity of being on arbaclofen for 4 months. Who's eligible for the study? Again, it's both girls and boys, and it's children and adolescents from 5 to 17 years old. It's people who have the 16p11.2 breakpoint 4 to breakpoint 5 deletion. I know there are various types of 16p deletion. Some of you who are on the line, it's possible don't have exactly this BP4 to BP5 deletion. That's something that the sites will be able to go over with you on the phone, look at the results of your genetic testing to make sure that you are eligible for this study. And individuals who have any other genetic diagnosis, of course, that's pretty unlikely, would not be eligible. It will also be for kids and adolescents who have some kind of developmental disability that requires support or therapy, special educational support, speech therapy, physical therapy, OT, etc. And that's just because we know that there is a subset of people with the 16p11.2 deletion who actually don't have any kind of delays, don't have disabilities that need support or therapy. And in that case, we don't think the drug is going to do anything for you. And so that's why those individuals would not be eligible to join the study. It's okay to be on other medications as long as the dosing of those medications has been stable. And also, we're going to ask people to have stable situations with their school and with their therapy. So it's okay, as I said, to be on other medications as long as it's no more than 2 neurologic or psychiatric medications. And as long as it does not include certain more powerful medications such as risperidol or Abilify or other medications that might interfere with our baclofen. It's a short list, but it's an important list to go through, and the sites will be able to go through that list to make sure that somebody is eligible before asking them to travel. In terms of schooling and therapy, of course, this is something that has been affected for a lot of people by COVID. We know that in most of the country, not quite all of the country, people have been doing remote schooling or hybrid schooling. Similarly, a lot of people's therapies have been affected, have been adjusted to be partially remote or less frequent or something like that. So we want to make sure everybody is in a stable situation there. so that any changes that happen during the study we can be confident are due to the drug as opposed to change in school therapy or something like that. So again, that's something that sites will be able to go over with the families on the phone. Of course, we don't want anybody to come into the study if they have other major medical issues going on that would be a safety concern somehow. For example, somebody who has seizures going on that are not completely controlled. We will be able to enroll individuals who have seizures as long as they are well controlled and on stable medication. Subjects in the study cannot be pregnant, and those who are of older ages who are sexually mature must be willing and commit to using contraception during the study. And that's simply because the drug has never been studied for possible effects on pregnancy. And at this point, we have to restrict enrollment to English-speaking families because a number of the assessments, a number of the tests and evaluations that we'll be using are only available for English-speaking children and teenagers. Finally, of course, the parents or guardians have to consent to participation, and the participants also have to assent to being in the study. Ultimately, sort of as I've been hinting at along the way, the people at each of the sites, whether you choose to go to Boston, Houston, or Seattle, they'll be going through all of these eligibility criteria, and they'll be making the final determination of who is eligible. Here's just a little diagram of what the study looks like. So as I mentioned before, the first travel trip to the site, the first visit to the site will be up to 3 days. It includes the various kinds of screening, evaluations, and then starting treatment. The first dose will be taken there at the site. And then subjects will gradually go up on the dose over about 5 weeks, and then come in for that second one-day visit, just a quick check, make sure everything is okay, everything is safe, a lot of phone calls along the way. Then they're on a stable dose of either arbaclofen or placebo. There'll still be more phone calls along the way. And then at the 16-week point, come in for the end of treatment evaluation at visit 3. That'll be a couple days long. Then taper down on the dose, phone calls along the way, and a final visit after coming completely off the drug. And then after that, as we mentioned, there's the open label study that people who have tolerated the drug okay and are interested can continue on medication. I want to say here that we saw one of the questions submitted beforehand: when will families know whether their child was on drug or placebo? So I actually realized I haven't been clear enough. During this initial study, nobody knows, not the doctor at the site, not the family. That's why it's called double-blinded. Both the people running the study and the family and the child or teenager don't know whether they're receiving arbaclofen or placebo. In the open label study, they will. But what happens here is that we will tell families whether their child was on arbaclofen or placebo, but not until the entire study is over, not until everybody has come off. And that's because we don't want word of mouth to be influencing people who are still in the study. We don't want somebody saying, oh, my child was on arbaclofen and they did great. Oh, he was doing so, his speech improved so much. I'm being very hopeful, of course. And we don't want it the other way around. It's like, oh, my child was on arbaclofen and he had terrible stomach aches. We don't want people being influenced by those kinds of word of mouth kinds of reports. And so it's really standard across all, almost all drug company studies, academic studies too, that people are told, but not until the end of the entire study, whether they got the active medication or placebo. So the open label extension study. As I said, this will be for participants who complete the placebo-controlled study and are doing okay. And the purpose actually, it's not just because we want to let people have drug. Really, it's to examine the safety of arbaclofen over a longer period of time. We need to know that, families need to know that, FDA wants to know that. They want to know what kind of whether there might be side effects that come up after 6 months instead of just during the 16-week period of the original study. So again, this will be another 4 months. So there will be some people who receive arbaclofen for 4 months initially, and then another 4 months. And so we will see if there are any kind of safety issues that might crop up later. We hope not. We don't think so, but we have to look at that question. It's 4 months, as I mentioned. Everybody in the open label would get the arbaclofen. The details of the study are still in the process of being ironed out. We will need families, of course, to travel back to the sites to get the arbaclofen and to get the safety checks. There will be some blood draws required there because part of the safety checks include making sure there's no effect, let's say, on people's blood counts, that there's no effect on people's blood, what we call blood chemistries or electrolytes, the sodium and potassium, that is not causing any other kinds of effects in the body that might show up on blood tests before people get any kind of symptoms. But the costs for the open label extension would be covered just as they are for the placebo-controlled study, and I'll get into that more on a slide that's coming up. So what kinds of evaluations, what kinds of assessments will be done in this study? The official study aim is to look at the safety and the efficacy, the safety and the benefits of arbaclofen. So we'll be looking at speech language, first of all, and this will include various audio recordings that can be analyzed more slowly, played back multiple times, really make sure we're hearing things correctly. It will also be analyzed by computer-based ways to look at the sound waves that people are producing. There will be a bunch of neuropsychology or school psychology assessments as well, looking at things like learning and memory, looking at IQ, and looking at what the psychologists call executive functions, such as attention, inhibition, and flexibility. We'll look at autism symptoms. Again, we're not requiring that people have a diagnosis of autism, but we know that some individuals will have a diagnosis of autism. So we'll be looking at those symptoms, including by doing assessments such as the ADOS, which is a standard evaluation for autism, and we'll be video recording them so they can be scored very carefully afterwards. And we'll also be doing assessments that are sometimes called biomarkers. So these are assessments that don't require anybody's judgment. It doesn't require the doctor's judgment. It doesn't require the speech therapist's judgment. It doesn't require a psychologist to think about and to score it, but really are sort of objective measurements. And so the biomarkers will include EEG. That's like the test that people with seizures have, just again, putting the electrodes on the scalp to record the brain waves. Then we'll also be looking at a computer analysis of movement. So this involves video recording again, just to see how smooth, how coordinated motor skills are before and after treatment. And finally, for safety, as we mentioned briefly before, there will be blood draws before and after treatment. So 2 blood draws in the core study, and then the open label will require at least 1 more blood draw to look at things like the blood count and the blood chemistries, and then also physical exams. And of course, this is just all to make sure that any side effects are detected, are recorded, so we know what's happening with the drug. Here are the sites. Boston up on the right, Houston down in the middle, and Seattle, of course, up on the left. Some of you will know the names of the researchers who are spearheading the study at each of these sites. In Seattle, Dr. Sarah Jane Webb, who's a psychologist. In Houston, Dr. Robin Kokel, who is a psychologist as well. And then in Boston, Lisa Prock, who's a developmental behavioral pediatrician, and Ellen Hansen, who's a psychologist. All of the sites also will have physicians working with them, of course. I just don't have them listed here because it's really being jointly led in Boston, but in Seattle and Houston, it's a single leader officially for this study. But of course, there are medical personnel at all sites to make sure safety is covered. How about study costs? Travel will be arranged and paid for. So families will not have to sustain any costs for travel. This includes ground transportation to and from the airport, airline tickets for one parent and child, so 2 people traveling, ground transportation at the site, hotel at the study site. Of course, if you live local to Houston, Boston, Seattle, and prefer to drive yourself, that's fine. We can also arrange for you to be driven if, say, you're, I don't know, 5 hours away and no flight makes sense. We can arrange ground transportation instead. And all of this will be effectively through a travel agent and billed to CRA, Clinical Research Associates, so there's no out-of-pocket cost for the family. Families also will be given a debit card for meal expenses while you're away from home. Here in this case, it really is advisable that receipts are kept by you, by the family participants, so that you can avoid paying any income tax on those funds, just so you have that documentation. We will also be providing financial compensation. In other words, participants will be paid for their time and effort. It's not, of course, it's not going to be tens of thousands of dollars. That wouldn't be appropriate. And ultimately, it's up to every site to decide exactly how much they'll be paying the subjects who they work with. But it'll be in line with other studies that drug companies are running, that Searchlight is running, because we recognize it is important to recognize the time and effort that people are putting into this. So how has COVID-19 affected all of our plans? Well, first of all, we had been hoping to kick this all off more than a year ago. We were really poised to enroll the first subjects last spring. We were hoping the study would get off the ground then, but of course, COVID hit us right then in March of 2020. So safety first. Each site, Boston, Houston, and Seattle, it's the Children's Hospital at each of those sites. Boston Children's Hospital, Seattle Children's Hospital, and in Houston, they call it Texas Children's Hospital. They all have their own policies. They're all still requiring masks. Some of them may have other requirements. And so people will have to come in wearing that PPE, wearing those face coverings. Some of the key assessments, especially the speech, of course, have to be done without masks, because masks can distort sound, can distort the sound that the tester is trying to say, and sometimes they'll ask the participant to imitate something they're saying, and it can also distort the sound that's coming out of the mouth of the participants in the study. So some of our evaluations must be done without masks, and that has to be cleared by the hospitals where the study is going on. Everything, of course, is still changing. You've probably all heard about the Delta variant of COVID that's going on. It's causing big surges in some places. Right now, of our 3 sites, Texas is much more affected than Boston or Seattle by these surges, but we don't know for sure. It's not going to hit Boston and Seattle either. So we are in regular contact with the sites to find out if they will allow that at least some of these evaluations be done without masks. We actually have pared down the total number of visits and the travel that we were thinking about originally, because of course there are the risks associated with travel. And of course, you probably all know that airlines, airports, they're all requiring people to wear masks throughout their entire journey. So that, of course, is something to be aware of. We do also recognize that vaccines help to protect us all. It helps the person who gets the vaccine, and also helps other people that someone comes in contact with. Even we know there are some people who get COVID, aren't terribly sick themselves, but they can spread it, and vaccines help with that. So at this point, the hospitals in many cases might have policies that only people who have been vaccinated will be allowed to come into their facility. So that's something else that we'll be checking on and could be changing as things progress. We all hope, of course, that maybe a few months from now, COVID will be way down, fingers crossed, and hospitals may change their policies then. But at this point, they're all requiring masks, and some of them may be limiting participation to people who've been vaccinated. We know also that besides these sort of public health considerations, that COVID has had a large impact on a lot of children and their families, including families in the 16p11.2 community. It's had an impact on their health. For many families, it's had an impact on their finances. It's had an impact on the schooling, of course, for a ton of kids around the country. And we talked about that a little bit already. So we will ask you, and the sites will ask you, to think carefully about your family circumstances. The study will involve a large effort. We know that asking families to travel all these times, to supervise the medication every day, multiple times a day, of course, that's a big effort. That's a big ask of you. We recognize that, and the sites recognize that. And we don't want anybody to take on the study if they don't feel that they're in a stable situation where they can handle all of this ask. So we want children to be in a stable situation. Again, it's so that we know that any improvement is because of the drug, not because other things are going wonderfully all of a sudden, and that any side effects, any downturn that we might see is due to the drug and is not due to something else that's going on in family life or school life or something like that. So what are the next steps? And this is my final slide. We are planning to start the study in September. So we want to see people enrolled in September of this year. Please look for official announcements that the study is opening up, that the sites are ready to be contacted, and we'll be sending those announcements out through Simon's Searchlight communications and also through the Facebook group for the 16p community. If you have any questions before then, if you want to let us know of your interest, please feel free to email me, and my email is there, pwang@clinicalresearchassociates.net. That's a lot of letters. You can also use pwang@simonsfoundation.org. And if you are interested, we'll be very happy to share your name and contact information with the sites. We've had a number of families contact us along the way, back toward the end of 2019 and early 2020 when we were hoping to get the study started up. Some families have written to us in the months since then also, saying, you know, how are things? Please let us know as soon as the sites are ready to schedule, and we will definitely pass all those names and contact information onto the sites. I want to just point you also to some general information about clinical trials, and this is from the American Academy of Pediatrics, which is the professional organization for pediatricians. There's a long web address here, of course, but if you just Google, should my child join a clinical trial, probably put in AAP there for American Academy of Pediatrics, you'll come to this, and it just gives general information, general questions that you should run through your own mind as you're thinking about whether you want your child to participate in this particular trial. So I'll leave that up for now, but that concludes our slide presentation, and we can move on to some questions.
Great, thanks, Dr. Wang. We've had a lot of great questions come in, and I'm going to try and be concise. So there are some questions about eligibility. You had mentioned that the age is 5 to 17 years, but just to be clear, that means that someone, for instance, who's 22 years old would not be eligible, and someone who's younger than 5 would not be eligible, at least not until they hit age 5. And currently, we don't have anything planned for the younger age group. Just to be clear, Dr. Wang, can they turn 18? Can they age up during the process of the trial? In other words, do they have to meet the eligibility simply at that first visit, or what happens in terms of age eligibility?
Yes, as long as they're 17 coming in, that's okay.
Okay, very good. So for the families, I know some of these questions came in before, so I hope maybe they're obvious to you now, but in terms of cooperativeness, in terms of, you know, some of our kiddos have issues and it might be challenged with challenging behaviors. do you have a sense of, are there certain children who will be, you think, more difficult in terms of being able to do the study activities? And at the screening visit, will that be determined in terms of eligibility based on their ability to do the instruments?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. It's something to talk over with the sites before you travel, and they'll ask you more details about your experience, what your child's behavior is like, how they've done maybe with other psychological evaluations, or let's say speech therapy evaluations that they've had. Um, and it's something that they will also assess in person if they think it makes enough sense for you to travel to the site for that assessment. But again, that's one of the reasons we're going with the 3 sites that we are, because these are sites who are experienced with 16p11.2 deletion, and also very broadly experienced with children who have developmental challenges, including behavioral challenges. So they have great personnel at the sites who are experienced working with kids who have challenging behaviors. So it's something that you can definitely talk over with them.
Great. Again, about the inclusion-exclusion criteria, there's a specific question about Adderall, and is Adderall itself an exclusion, a drug of exclusion?
It's not. So it's okay if your child is on Adderall, as long as he or she is not on more than 2 neurologic or psychiatric drugs. That's just one, and as long as their dose is stable on Adderall, that's okay.
Okay. And is there any, in terms of a child who might need surgery during the time of the study, is there any concern about use of general anesthesia on baclofen, arbaclofen?
There's no particular concern with that. Uh, for example, kids who take racemic baclofen because they have cerebral palsy, they have surgery for various reasons sometimes, and that's okay. On the other hand, it would be much better to plan on study participation some other time when the surgery would not be during the study, but to probably wait until the surgery has been finished and your child has recuperated fully before enrolling in the study.
Okay. So in terms of families coming, you had mentioned that it's one family member for the participant in the trial, so just one family member. And
Yes.
then there's some questions about basically flexibility, knowing that we have many families that work. Will all of these evaluations be done on weekdays, or is there any option for weekend evaluations or study visits?
That'll be site by site, really. Some of them we believe do have weekend flexibility. But for example, that first visit is a 3-day visit. And I unfortunately, I don't think, for example, any of the sites would be able to do everything over, let's say, Thanksgiving or something like that. So it would be at least 1 or 2 weekdays.
Sure. And then the days you're talking about as the length on what you showed us, that's not including travel time, correct? So travel time would be at the front end and the back end in addition to what you showed.
Exactly right. So a 3-day visit means 3 days at the site. Depending on exactly what your flight schedule is, it might be possible to fly back home, let's say on the evening of that 3rd day. But yes, it's 3 days plus the travel.
Okay, great. So with this, there correctly noted, hypotonia is a problem with some individuals in our community, and racemic baclofen has been used to treat spasticity before. Are you guessing that this is going to have any effects that might exacerbate hypotonia, or is there any concern for individuals with hypotonia?
So yeah, it's a great question to think about tone, because cerebral palsy, the spasticity that they use racemic baclofen for is hypertonia, high tone, and racemic baclofen seems to help that by bringing it down. So it's a great question to wonder whether it'll decrease tone further in somebody who already has low tone. In the autism and Fragile X studies that have been done with arbaclofen, they did not see that problem. So there were some subjects who were low tone going into those studies, and the arbaclofen did not decrease their tone further. But for sure, that's something that you can talk over with the sites, and it's something that they will watch carefully if you do enroll in the study. And they would adjust the dose if needed to, if the tone gets too low. or they might say, okay, that's it. We need to take you off drug. The safety first, for sure.
Great. So you went over the outcome measures, but just to review it again, what do you think this is going to affect in terms of what part of the way the brain's functioning? And when you think about this, how long is this likely to last? Is it just while someone's taking the medication, or do you expect sort of a spillover and a long-lasting effect even when someone stops?
So thank you for asking that question. The honest answer is we don't know for sure. We know what the drug does in mice, but that does not always translate to people. In mice, it seems to help with learning and memory, and it also seems to help with motor coordination. So we hope that'll be the case in people as well. The drug works on a receptor. It's called the GABA B receptor that's really found all over the brain. Almost every neuron has these GABA B receptors. So we think it'll be broad effects, and we hope it'll have effects on the speech language motor, the articulation, the oral coordination, possibly on other motor also. We hope it'll help with learning and memory. That's why we're also looking for that. We don't have a guarantee on any of that, but we hope it will affect all those areas. How long will the effect last? We don't know that either, unfortunately. The best guess is that it's a medication that will help while a child is on it, but I'd have to say we'd be pleasantly surprised, but we'd be surprised if it has a lasting effect after the child comes off of it. Of course, if a child has learned something while they're on medication, we don't think they're going to forget it after they stop medication. But maybe the pace of the learning might be faster on medication, and then off medication might go back to what the previous pace was.
So those are the good things that could happen. What if there's a side effect? What if there's a problem, and can we stop? So if a child is then starting to have trouble in some way, are they stuck in it to the end? What happens then?
Yes. If there are troubling side effects, you can stop at any time. That's really important to know, and it's really important to think about. The good thing about arbaclofen and the good thing about racemic baclofen and the hundreds of thousands of people who have taken racemic baclofen is that it does not have long-lasting side effects. It does not have permanent side effects at all. The side effects go away when the medication is stopped. So that is really the reason why we have built in all of these phone calls, why we do have that visit in the middle of the study after somebody has reached the peak dose that they tolerate, to make sure there's nothing going on. And if there is, and it's too much for anyone to want to continue, they can come out.
Right. From the evaluations, are parents going to get any reports back? Are they going to see, the psychometric tests or anything else? Will they get any of that information back?
Yes, they will. Absolutely. That can be valuable information, we know, for schools, for planning other kinds of therapy. So that will go back to the families.
And is that true of something like EEGs as well, or is it just the neuropsych reports?
It's just the neuropsych, psych and speech, for example, kinds of reports. The EEG that we're doing here is not useful information. Of course, if the EEG picks up that somebody has seizures, for sure, we will let the family know. We don't think that's going to happen. That's very unlikely. But if they see something that families need to know about, for sure, they'll be told.
And if something should come up from a blood test, one of those safety tests that you mentioned, what happens then if there's a problem with one of those tests?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, for sure, family will be informed of anything that's that is concerning on the blood tests. For example, there'll also be urine tests but on any of those safety evaluations, if there's something going on, families will be told. And then the doctors at each site will think about it with the family. Is this something that could be caused by the drug? If they think it's a drug side effect and it's important, then they'll say, okay, we either need to go down on the dose or the child needs to come out of the study. If it's something else, they'll say, okay, this is something that perhaps you should follow up on with your own doctor at home, pediatrician, family doctor, other, or they'll work it out with the family and talk through it and figure out what needs to be done.
So let's think positively. If this trial is successful, what happens then for the rest of the community in terms of either if you didn't meet the inclusion criteria or you didn't participate? Give us some sense of how long these things take.
Yeah. So we are hoping that this is a study that we'll be able to do in a year to a year and a half, that we'll enroll it and get the results back in, let's say, somewhere around getting all the results back can take a little bit of time, a couple months at least after the last participant has finished. So let's say in a year and a half, we have positive results. That would be wonderful. What happens then with any experimental drug is that the company or the foundation that is running the study has to take that to the FDA. And they say, hey, FDA, look at these positive results we got. And then FDA goes over it with a really fine-tooth comb. It's the same kind of thing that you've seen with the COVID vaccines recently. FDA wants to see all those data before they say other people can use it outside of a study. Sometimes FDA says, that looks great, but we want you to do another study, maybe in a different age group. And I know some people might be thinking, what about adult? They might say, okay, well, we want to see you tested in adults too, before we allow it to be prescribed, because we're just worried somebody will give it to an adult even though it's never been tested there. So the short answer is, if it's a positive result, it goes to the FDA, and then we will be working with FDA to think about exactly what the next steps are. In rare situations, in rare circumstances, FDA might say, okay, these results are so great, we're going to approve the drug now. That would be a grand slam. I don't think we can count on that. No way we can count on that. That's extremely rare. We can hope for that, but we certainly can't count on that.
Okay. A couple other logistical eligibility issues. So you mentioned being able to start enrollment in fall 2021. Just to be clear, it's not as if everyone has to enroll in fall 2021. Is that correct? Do you want to give folks a sense of how long enrollment might be?
That's exactly right. We don't expect everyone to enroll this fall, and in fact, we couldn't do that because the sites would be overwhelmed. They can't all of a sudden have like 20 people show up in Houston and say, okay, we're all starting drug today. They have basically a capacity limitation, like they can only take a certain number of people at a time. And I'm sure we'll be enrolling, if we start this fall, I'm sure we'll still be enrolling well into 2022. Almost probably, I would say, even summer of next year. Even if we start this fall, there'll still be people who are starting in summer of next year.
Okay, very good. So folks are thinking of all sorts of logistical questions, which is great. So if we went over the travel policy, we're paying for one parent, but what if another parent wants to come, not necessarily being paid for, but can they accompany them if they need some help? What if there are two children in the family? Do you get one parent for each child? Do you think you can schedule multiple children in the same visit? Then I think some of these we'll get to with individual sites and logistics at that point. But I don't know, Dr. Wang, if you have any general comments you want to make about that.
Yeah, I think you're right that it's something probably best to be worked out with the site. I think in terms of compensation, I think it's fair if you have two kids, we can have two parents who are traveling. Play one-on-one defense instead of one parent have to play a zone defense. So I think that's okay, yeah.
Okay. Again, some eligibility criteria, and the genetic counselors at Geisinger can help with this. Is some folks are trying to figure out whether or not they're breakpoint 4 or breakpoint 5 or exactly sort of whether they meet. And perhaps afterwards, we'll send, just for those of you who are questioning, we're going to send out an electronic link to this so you can listen to it again if it's helpful. And maybe what we'll do at that point is clarify some of the information to figure out on your genetic test report, whether or not you're the breakpoint 4, breakpoint 5 that qualifies for this. And if there's ever a question, it'll be part of the screening. And again, the genetic counselors at Geisinger will be able to help with this as well. But specifically in terms of vitamins, mineral supplementations, as long as you're stable throughout this, you can take those vitamins. That's no problem. We just want to make sure that things are stable as you're going into this. But there's another question about how verbal an individual needs to be. Is there any requirement for a certain either being verbal in at all? So some of our younger folks, especially, what if they only have single words? Can they still be involved?
The answer is yes, they can still be involved. There's no requirement for any specific number of words or phrases or sentences.
Okay. And I'm sure it's going to come up during the course of this study. COVID vaccines are not yet available for children under the age of 12. Can they take the vaccine during the study? Is there going to be any contraindication to taking the vaccine in the middle?
No, that will be fine. We want people to get the protection from the vaccine as soon as it's available for them, so that's fine.
Okay. And if you don't mind going over it again, I know it's a little bit confusing, but there's baclofen and arbaclofen. And can you just go over one more time this kind of right-hand, left-hand version and what's FDA approved and what's not FDA approved and why we have to go through this study with arbaclofen specifically?
Right. So baclofen is currently FDA approved. That's how people usually refer to it. They just call it baclofen. The longer descriptive name is racemic baclofen, and racemic means it's a 50-50 mixture of R and S. So that's what's approved. It's used in kids and adults with cerebral palsy. It's used in adults with multiple sclerosis also. It's approved in many other countries, not just the US. So there really is a long track record with it. The reason we're studying arbaclofen, which is just half of baclofen, if you will, is that we think it might be better than racemic baclofen. And actually, that's what we're hearing in the Fragile X community, where there was a previous study done with arbaclofen, that it seems that arbaclofen alone has fewer side effects than the mixture, than the racemic baclofen, which is already available. So that's the reason for the focus here on arbaclofen.
And I think our final question, do you get to choose your site of those 3 sites you mentioned?
Yes, absolutely.
Very good. I think we've managed to get through the questions, which were really insightful and thoughtful questions. So I can tell people have really been listening carefully and starting to think ahead about all sorts of possibilities. I'm going to give one last opportunity to make sure I didn't miss anything, but I don't think I did. Okay, so we're going to again post this material afterwards. For those again who had questions, you'll be able to go back and see the eligibility criteria. Again, it's 5 to 17 years old or before you've hit your 18th birthday. If you age into the study, so if you hit 5 years old while we're open to enrollment, then you'd still be able to apply. And we don't currently have plans for any studies either for individuals beyond that age range. I think we're hoping that this is going to be successful within this age range, although time will tell. But we don't currently have anything planned for those who are outside of that age range. So thanks, Dr. Wang, especially for taking your time on a Saturday to talk with us as a community. I can say I'm personally very excited that we're finally getting to the point of thinking about treatment. I do want to say, though, that we don't know that this is going to be effective. So this is a clinical trial. It is, again, going to be blinded both to you and to the investigator. So that's the way we can make sure that we're unbiased in looking at this. It does mean that for those of you who might have with your school nurse course or something, the list of medications your child is on, you won't actually get anything to give the school nurse to say they're on arbaclofen or not on arbaclofen. We'll be able to write a note saying that they're in a clinical trial and that they're randomized. But literally, you can't get that note from the doctor even at the clinical site because they don't know that. So if there's anyone who doesn't feel comfortable with any part of this, of course, there's no obligation whatsoever to participate. But on the other hand, I do think that Dr. Wang has been very thoughtful in terms of thinking about all the safety issues and making sure the study is well designed so that it's not a waste of people's time, but that it's being done responsibly. So watching out if there is anything that's an issue. So Dr. Wang, any last words before we wrap up?
No, I just want to thank everybody for their interest, for tuning in on their Saturday. So huge thank you to all of you. I want to let you know that we've had a lot of behind the scenes help here. It's not just Dr. Chung and me, Erica Jones from Simons, and from Geisinger, Curtis Weaver and Dr. Cora Taylor have been doing a lot behind the scenes here. They've been instrumental in a lot of Searchlight's work, really pretty broadly.
Great. So yes, we do want to thank everyone on the very large team of Simon Searchlight that's behind the scenes. If you do have questions, again, we'll be sending this out, but you can go to our website, thesimonsearchlight.org, and you can email directly coordinator@simonsearchlight.org, and we'll be glad to answer any of your questions, either at the clinical trial or just in general, anything that we're doing with Searchlight. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.